Hi everyone, welcome to another Hatton's Model Railways live stream, and today we're looking at the history of the British Rail Class 47 diesel locomotive, the most numerous diesel mainline locomotive to work on the British railway system ever. And of course, you've got nearly 60 years of history from the top to the bottom of Britain where these locomotives operated. So as ever on one of our Real Railway profiles, we'll be looking into the history of these particular locomotives and the models past and present that have been made in N gauge, double O gauge, and some of the other scales there too. So sit back and relax and enjoy the story of the Class 47. If you have any particular questions at all, feel free to add them in the chat on the video if you're watching live, or if you're watching back a little bit later on, put a comment on the video or get in touch with our customer experience team who would be more than happy to help you. So, to tell you the story of the Class 47, we have to go a little bit back before the introduction of the actual locomotives to understand the purpose why they were required on the network. A lot of the original diesel locomotives introduced from the 1950s had come into service with varying degrees of success. Many of these designs hadn't been trialled before they were built and put into service. So the British Transport Commission were looking for more diesel locomotives, but they were looking for more reliable designs, lighter designs, and they did wish to test them too before they were built. On the 15th of January 1960, the British Transport Commission decided that they wanted a Type 4 locomotive, which could supply over 2,500 horsepower and also work on a 6-axle Coco wheel arrangement, as we see here. So this was a change from the locomotives that have been built before, with either 16 wheels or some of the heavier, less powerful designs out there too. The technology really was changing to be able to handle this in locomotives, and it was put out to tender with locomotive building companies building different locomotives to act as prototypes for the different fleets. The main three that were constructed were Lion, which was built by the Birmingham Railway and Carriage Wagon Works Company, also in line with Sulzer, using an upgraded version of the power unit that had been fitted to the peak class locomotives, which became the Class 44s, 45s and 46s. We also had English Electric, who entered the DP2, Diesel Prototype 2, which had the innards of a Class 50, as it would become, put inside a Deltic body shell. And also we had Falcon, which was built by Brushworks in Loughborough, which was a brush-built locomotive with 2 Maybach power units in there. These locomotives were built during 1961 and 1962 and entered service for trials, but the story changes there a little bit. It was decided that locomotives of this style were needed a lot quicker than was expected on the network, so there wasn't really the time to test these locomotives thoroughly before deciding on a builder. The final Class 46 peak locomotives were under construction at this time, with many of the parts ordered by Brushworks, and it was decided that the final 20 of these locomotives would actually be built as the first 20 of the new type of locomotives. So anyone making the design would now have to use a lot of those parts that were ordered for the final peak locomotives. So Brush got the contract, built the first 20 of the locomotives that we know now as the Class 47, which we can see on the screen here next to one of the steam locomotives that it replaced. These engines fulfilled the requirements by the British Transport Commission, working on a 6-wheel axle there with 2,750 horsepower supplied by a 12-cylinder Sulzer power unit, which had been trialled in the Lion prototype. So this was a very successful prototype, and it had the most influence on the Class 47 as built. So these locomotives first came into service in 1962. There was 20 of them originally, and these had some minor differences to the production models, but they entered service across the UK alongside the prototype locomotives that they had now replaced. So these had some differences to the main locos that were built. They had different brakes, but they also had both steam and electric train heating. Although the majority of vehicles still on the network still had the steam heating pipes, electric train heating was starting to take over in newer vehicles being built, especially with the Mark II coaches that would be built a couple of years after the introduction of the Class 47. So these locos started to appear, and they were an immediate success on the network, proving very reliable. The 95-mile-an-hour designated top speed was really useful on some of the expresses, and they did indeed replace some of the earlier diesel locomotives on some routes. They were initially introduced in the northeast of England, but also made their home in the southwest of Wales too, and spread throughout the country during the mid to late 1960s. Some very minor changes did happen to the locomotives in the 1960s. More of them were built, with 270 ordered almost immediately after the first 20 locomotives entered service. These were ordered from Brush Traction in Loughborough, and many were built there too. While these 270 were being built, further locomotives were ordered to make a total 512 of these Class 47 locomotives, the most diesel mainline locomotives of one class there has ever been on the UK railway scene. And these were delivered right up to 1968, with the last 202 actually built by British Rail under contract at their Crewe Works in Cheshire. So these were being turned out for a 6-year period, showing you the development that went into this design. Although the first 20 had the electric train heat, the rest of the locomotives were either built with just a steam heat boiler or no boiler at all. There were 81 locomotives designated purely for freight duties across the UK, and the rest had the steam heating boiler fitted when they came in. So see here from this locomotive in the late 1960s, they were built with the familiar 4-character head codes on the front, which could be wound around from inside the cab to show the different head codes that were fitted to the locomotives. All of the class was supplied in this original two-tone green livery that we see here too. Slightly different from the livery seen on some of the other different locomotives, changed over for the style and body shape of the Class 47 that we see here. One of the final elements of these locomotives is the power units were actually downrated in the mid-1960s. Although they were capable and originally used to produce 2,750 horsepower, the Class 47s were downrated for reliability purposes to 2,580 horsepower. So still more than enough to handle the many varied and mixed duties that they carried out, including some of the famous express services. And they also made a good reliable appearance on a lot of the newly introduced Freightliner duties that were coming into service in the 1960s, as you can see here on the screen now. Passing through, I believe that's Reading, but I'm sure someone will correct me on the exact location of that there. So the numbering scheme originally started from 1500 to 1999, with the additional locomotives added as 1100 to 1111. 5 of these locomotives were built with an experimental Sulzer 12-cylinder power unit, although this only lasted a couple of years before the locomotives were returned to the original factory specs, but they did last long enough to get their own tops class specification of Class 48 rather than Class 47. Another side story from the Class 47 tale is the locomotives that were built for use in Cuba. Now, this was a bit controversial at the time, with locomotives from Britain being supplied to the Cuban mainland. But these locomotives were built by Brush. Officially on paper, they were built by Clayton to save some of the controversy, but these were very similar inside and outside to the Class 47 locomotives that we are becoming familiar with throughout today's stream. Thank you, Neil. Thanks for confirming that's Reading. That's absolutely fantastic. I do appreciate you checking up on that for me. So the locomotives, we'd started to get over 500 of these in service now, and they were seen at most of the major depots in Britain. You could have an allocation of 47s pretty much everywhere throughout the network, from the late 1960s into the early 1970s onwards, used on a wide variety of duties. They were based at many depots on the Western region, replacing some of the Western hydraulic diesels, on express services with fleets allocated to Old Oak Common Depot in London, Bristol Depot and Landor Depot in South Wales too. Various locomotives based in depots in the Midlands, such as Crewe Diesel and Bescot Diesel Depot. Other depots on the eastern region included Finsbury Park and Stratford, where the locomotives were used on expresses on the Great Eastern Main Line from Liverpool Street to Norwich, and on other duties there too. Right up into Scotland, we had Haymarket, Eastfield and Inverness depots, all having allocations of these Class 47 locomotives. So as you can see, they really are starting to make appearances on all different sorts of duties all across the UK. Even heading down to some of the smaller freight duties, as we can see here, this Class 47 passing Dawlish on a set of Clayhood wagons that you can see. The 47 really did start to make its mark and started to appear everywhere on the UK's railway network. So there were some changes that started to appear during the 70s, although a lot of the locomotives, pretty much all of them, were painted into this BR blue colour scheme by the mid-1970s. There was still some different options and some tweaks to the locomotives that came to start providing a little bit of individuality. A very small number, around 12 or so, of the original locomotives were named, allocated to the Western region, and named in a similar fashion to the Western hydraulics and Great Western locomotives that had ran before them. Other than this, there was no real naming policy for the Class 47s until the late 1970s, when depots such as Stratford started to apply names and, in some cases, certain livery embellishments, as we see here. This is one of the first locomotives in the large Loco livery, County of Herefordshire, but this has had some amendments for the Royal Wedding in 1981. So some colour started to appear on the Class 47 fleet by this time. The main large logo colour scheme came in, and this, in my opinion, really suited the Class 47s the most, really made to fit their body style there too, and this came in from the early 1980s. But we did still have a lot of the locomotives in the original BR Blue colour scheme that you can see here. It wasn't just the colours that changed in this time. There was a lot of mechanical changes to the locomotives too. You can see here in this particular picture, the head code box has been plated over and 2 twin lights have been fitted. You've also got a high intensity headlight there, which was fitted to some of the locomotives from the late 1970s onwards. More and more of the locomotives were fitted with electric train heating too, with a lot of the original steam heat or no heat locomotives converted to have the electric train heating, as more and more coaches, such as the Mark IIs and the air-conditioned Mark II Ds, Es and Fs, required this rather than the steam heat boilers that the locomotives were fitted with. The Class 47s also had slow speed control on those 81 freight locomotives that we mentioned towards the start of the stream, although again, a lot of these locomotives were starting to be converted into passenger locomotives with the fitment of the electric train heating. Some other experiments and prototypes happened, and one of the main ones is the conversion of initially 12 locomotives, but finally 17, to be able to work on push-pull trains. So these worked with a Mark II coach converted into a driving trailer on fast, high-speed services running between Glasgow, Edinburgh, and eventually Inverness and Aberdeen too. These locomotives were uprated to work at 100 miles an hour, and these were fitted with the control pipes that you can see on the end of this Class 47 here. So these were some of the hardest work Class 47s heading into the 1980s, with the first locomotives converted from 1979. One last locomotive to make a mention of, and it is unique, but it's twice unique, is this particular Class 47, which acted as a test bed, not once, but twice. Originally known as number 47601, it was used as a trial for the Class 56 locomotives under development in the mid-1970s, with a Class 56 Ruston power unit installed in 1975. In 1979, it was trialled again with a Class 58 power unit when the Class 58s were under construction. This had over 3,000 horsepower, so it certainly was the most powerful 47 to have ever ran. And this locomotive was then upgraded to this in 1979 and ran for about 10 years or so with this experimental power unit. So the 47s, even after just 15 years or so, had already seen some changes, and they were going to see a lot more before the 20th century was out. Some of those freight locomotives started to get some of the livery changes too in the 1980s, with the original rail freight grey colour scheme that you can see on the screen here designating the purely freight locomotives, although they were still trusted with the Freightliner duties as we see here. The sectorisation of the passenger schemes led to a lot of new liveries coming in there too, with Intercity and ScotRail getting their own branding, as you can see here, very distinct and completely different than the large logo colour scheme than had gone before. This was changed a couple of times over the years and adapted into the familiar Intercity Swallow colour scheme from the late 1980s, used on charters, but also the majority of cross-country workings that the Class 47s had found their homes on too. So these locomotives also were upgraded, with many of them becoming an extra subclass known as the Class 47/8 locomotives. These were fitted with extra fuel tanks to allow them to be long-range locomotives. When working on some of those cross-country duties, the diagrams lasted over 1,000 miles in some cases, working right across the country before they were able to be refueled. So these locomotives, with their extra fuel capacity, were able to pick up some of the longest distance services in the UK, working with the Mark II air-conditioned coaches that we mentioned there before. So a lot of locomotives went over to the intercity sector at this time, but were still found on some of their traditional routes too. Some of the locomotives also started working for what's called the parcels sector, and although they had worked on parcels trains for many years throughout their lives, they now had a distinct and dedicated colour scheme for this, as we see here, with the red and black livery that we can see on these locos. Heading towards privatisation in the 1990s, several locomotives were again converted into an updated version of the push-pull locomotives designed for use in Scotland. These had a slightly different control system, but also had the long-range tanks fitted, and these were able to work with push-pull mail trains that were being converted in the 1990s. As you can see here from this locomotive, these became the Class 47 subclass 2, although a different set of numbering was used to differentiate them from the Scottish locomotives that were still in service on those trains in Scotland. By the early 1990s, some of the locomotives had hung around in their original areas, with some of the locomotives allocated to London's depots still working out of Paddington and Stratford, but these passenger services were fewer and further between, although the locomotives, as you can see here, gained liveries appropriate to the area, such as the Network South East colours here, and one gained the provincial Transpennine colour scheme for the locos that worked on the route from Liverpool to Scarborough across the Pennines in the north of England. So the 47 really held up well in this period. A lot of locomotives were being withdrawn throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, but the 47 really held its own, either as a reliable freight locomotive or passenger locomotives working on a lot of those interregional and cross-country duties. This carried on into privatisation, with users such as Virgin Trains taking over the cross-country routes and applying their own distinct colour schemes to the locomotives. And some of those interregional operators, such as Great Western Trains, as we see here, retaining fleets of the Class 47 locomotives, as well as Freightliner and EWS. But the change into the 21st century really was the time when the Class 47 started to fade from a lot of these duties, being replaced on passenger services by more modern multiple units, such as the Voyager trains, or on the Western region, some of the modern multiple units that came into service down there. And on freight services, as with a lot of British rail design locomotives, they were slowly but surely being replaced by Class 66 locomotives across the network too. Some of the Class 47s, around 30 or 40 of them, were chosen to have a full life extension programme with full bodywork overall of various different degrees and a brand new General Motors power unit fitted to them. These became the Class 57 locomotives, and many of these can still be seen in use today, although they were initially supplied for Freightliner, and Virgin trains, and also Great Western trains too. You can now see them with a variety of operators such as Rail Operations Group and Direct Rail Services. We will be covering the Class 57 story in a future video, so if you want to find out more about those locomotives, stay tuned on our YouTube channel. But heading back over to the Class 47, the numbers, as we said, did start to dwindle, although deliveries really started to pick up in this period too, where locomotives were transferred between a lot of different privatised operators. We saw one-off liveries, such as the Anglia colour scheme we see on this locomotive here. We do start to see some other upgrades to the Locos still happening after almost 40 years in service, with the LED headlights and the orange connector for the multiple working system on the front of this locomotive. So upgrades were still happening throughout the 2000s, but the main work for the Class 47 was disappearing, either by replacement on the freight services with the withdrawal of the Freightliner and EWS locomotives by the end of 2004, and their removal from the cross-country and interregional services from the likes of Virgin Cross Country and Great Western trains too, with these services again ending by the end of 2004. However, the 47 lived on with a lot of private operators. The design was just too useful to retain and keep going with other suppliers, but they were kept on with some of the private operators, as you can see here with West Coast Railways, a private charter operator who uses heritage rolling stock. The Class 47s were a perfect locomotive with the ability to supply the electric train heat to keep the coaches warm whilst on rail tour duties, and of course the abundance of spares and locomotives available and being made available in the mid-2000s. A huge amount of operators such as West Coast Railways, Fragonset Railways and more did pick up large amounts of the Class 47s at this time and keep them going on their original duties. Some of these operators painted them back into the original colour schemes, or some of the earlier colour schemes that we can see here too. So even though it is a 21st century photo, we can still see the classic design of the BR two-tone green livery here on this locomotive. And that's really how the Class 47 story has gone for around the last 15 years or so. They have worked with a variety of different private operators out there, and the numbers haven't really shrunk since the changeover in around 2005 or so. Although some operators have operated them and now don't have a fleet anymore, such as Direct Rail Services here, Colas Rail 2, and locomotives designated for work on the Northern Bell, the prestigious train that runs around the north of England. The Locos still are in service with a lot of private operators and are still proving a strong, reliable, dependable design out there too. You can see some of the Locos out there on the charter services that we mentioned, in service with some of the private freight operators such as GB Rail Freight, and indeed some of the private spot hire companies, including the Rail Operations Group, as you see here. So the story of the Class 47 is still a story that's really being told. As they come up to 60 years of operation in 2022, it will be very interesting indeed to see where these reliable, dependable locomotives carry on going as they're making new ground every year, working on brand new services, different operations, and keeping the flag flying for these Sulzer 12-cylinder powered machines. So that really is the story so far, and I look forward to bringing you an update on the Class 47 story, maybe in a few years' time, and we'll see what other twists and turns we can learn along the way. Let's have a quick look at the models. And again, these have been part of a lot of manufacturers' ranges from around the 1960s onwards. We can see here the original Hornby model, which is originally from the late 1960s, painted and made available for around 30 years or so, this particular model, in a variety of different colour schemes. You can still pick them up if you want a bargain locomotive. And for its time, it really was a good model with a high amount of detail for modelers there in the 1960s and 1970s. Next up in double O gauge was the Lima model, which came out in the 1980s, which again had a huge amount of detail and was a step up from the previous designs. This loco has stood the test of time, and now, although not quite as detailed as the main range locomotives forms an essential part of Hornby's railroad range, with the Lima body placed here on an upgraded chassis with some improvements, but it is still mainly that Lima model from the 1980s. So you can see there the quality that went into this model over time. The Lima Class 47 is also a great way to pick up a Class 47 in many liveries. They produced over 100 of these different designs in the years that they made them, and you can see them regularly on our pre-owned section too. If you want to head over to that link in the description, there is a link there to every single Class 47 we have available in model form at the moment. Heading through to some of the super detail models, we have initially the, let me find it, the Helgen model here, which was released in the early 2000s, again in a variety of different liveries. It was the first model to be digital ready with an 8-pin digital socket, and it had fully working lights in there too. So this was a great upgrade again from the Lima model that had gone before. As you spot in here, there's probably a pattern of around every 10 years or so, a brand new 47 model coming along, being an upgrade and replacing the model that went before it. And that's absolutely no different in the late 2000s when we saw two different models come through. We saw the Vitrains model, sorry, that's the Helgen model there. We saw the Vitrains model supplied, which was a development of the original Lima Class 47, and Bachmann also brought out their own 00 gauge model too. So these models have been around on the market for around 10 years or so now, and as we've said, after 10 years, it's time again for a new Class 47 model to come out, and that is something we'll be seeing in 2021 and 2022, with the advent of the Helgen Class 47 here, available to pre-order right now in many different liveries. You've got full lighting control there, as we expect for a model developed in 2020, and a huge amount of great specifications in there too, and a fully die-cast chassis. So if you want to head over to the website to find out more information on that, you are certainly able to. This is a model that's also being produced in O gauge. So you can see here a hand-decorated sample. Helgen are working alongside the different models that are available. So it really is worth a look at what we have available right now and available to pre-order. So I hope that answers your question there a little bit, Eugene. There's some great options that are available right now. Whether you want to pick up one of the pre-owned older locomotives, which still has a great amount of detail, whether you're looking at the Lima range or the original Hornby model. Hornby, of course, have the Railroad Class 47 available in a couple of different liveries at the moment, which is a development of the Lima model. We do have the Bachmann Class 47, the Vitrains, and the original Helgen models available in our pre-owned listings too. But if you want the Rolls Royce of 47, shall we say, with a superbly detailed model, have a look at the information available right now, whether you're an O gauge or a 00 gauge modeler for the forthcoming Class 47 from Helgen that you can see there too. Whilst we're covering N-gauge modelers, we have various different models made from Graham Farish. This is one of the original models from the 1990s. But again, this has been recently retooled with fully working lights and a 6-pin digital socket. And you can pick this up right now. We do have them from time to time on our pre-owned listings too. If you've not learnt enough about the Class 47s today, we've been here almost half an hour now discussing these fine locomotives. But if you'd like to learn more, we have got a full guide on the locomotives on our website too, including every single livery carried by the locomotives, where they have worked, including the locomotive that's currently based in Hungary too. We have some information on the international use of the Class 47. We have every single locomotive listed there with its different types, liveries, specifications. It would take hours and hours to read through, and I really do recommend it if you want to learn more and you want to check out more on these locos. So head over to that link in the description. If half an hour has not been enough for you on the Class 47s, we can provide you with hours and hours more information on these particular locomotives. And as you can imagine, with the most numerous design used on the British Rail network, and the story still far from being over, there is so much more to say on the Class 47 locomotives, but I really hope I've given you a flavour today of the history of this design, of the models that are available, and hopefully whetted your appetite for picking up one of the fantastic models that is available now. If you do have any further questions on the models seen here today or the prototype locomotives, or you've any interesting information to add or your own recollections, please do comment on the video or get in touch with our customer experience team, who would be more than happy to help you. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like our Facebook page for more great videos like this, including real railway profiles, model railway skills cast sessions, and of course, all the latest model railway news too. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.